Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So, change of plans.
Yes.
I have actually brought an article from the newest issue of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about today. But we will definitely talk about the Alabama Solution documentary soon. So be patient with us, folks. We promise we'll get there. The piece I brought for today is from the 8th issue of Hammer and Hope that was just released a few weeks ago. And we've both been really excited to check it out. And thank you for your suggestion of this piece. So the piece we read is called Whose Streets? Trump's Federalized National Guard and the Long Arc of White Supremacy. And it's actually an interview and conversation between Olúfẹ Táíwò, who we love here on the podcast. We've engaged with a ton. We read his book, Elite Capture, way back in 2022. I can't believe it's been that long. And we also read his book, Reconsidering Reparations, earlier this year. And Olúfẹ interviews Elizabeth Hinton in this piece. She's a historian, author, and professor of history and Black studies at Yale University. Her research focuses on poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence here in the United States throughout the 20th century. And so this piece is this conversation between Olúfẹ and Elizabeth. It was all about the Trump administration's deployment of the National Guard to cities across the country and the federalization of local law enforcement right here in our backyard in Washington, D.C. And we even saw that one night we went out, which is crazy. They talk about that and analyze it from the perspective and in the context of history and precedent and policy, social justice organizing and movements like the Civil Rights Movement and even Black Lives Matter more recently, the criminal punishment system, policing, white supremacy, and democracy. And I know I named a lot of things there, but their conversation was so incredible because they did a wonderful job weaving all of those pieces of context together to give us an informed perspective on the significance of this decision to deploy and use the National Guard in this way and to federalize law enforcement in this way and, you know, what all of that means for our politics and our government and our society. So yeah, I really enjoyed this piece a lot. I think there's a lot to talk about from it, and I always appreciate the incredible insight and analysis from Olúfẹ Táíwò, and Elizabeth offers some great insight and analysis as well. So this is a really rich conversation. Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think this is such a great conversation that brings a lot of present federalization of the police and the deployment of the National Guard, gives it some real context with history that Elizabeth Hinton brings in the conversation. And she explores the tension between what's unprecedented and what's actually been done before, but maybe in a different way. She talks about this concern that the framers had with tyranny and a federal police force seeming more tyrannical and closer to a standing army that would negatively impact the ideals that claimed to be founding the country upon.
Right.
And she said that they were obsessed with tyranny, and it was her choice of words,
right?
Which sounds accurate to me.
Yeah.
And she also talks about going through some of the archives of previous presidential administrations, trying to find workarounds for this. They were chatting in the background of how can we work around this kind of idea of federalizing the police force. But ultimately their conversations, or what she saw in them, was that they didn't think it would be accepted by the American public.
Right.
And so we can see already some of the ways that this administration, this regime, is throwing out precedent and concerns from the framers to do whatever it is that they want to do, which is not surprising. They've been doing that since 2016, when that man went into the office for the first time. But it's helpful to understand and explore the context of what's been acceptable and what hasn't been acceptable, even if as we talk about federalizing police force, like, in my mind, there's very little reason to do that, if at all, and to have federalized police at all. All of that stuff in the context of like abolitionist discussions is its own thing. But understanding what is the dangerous part, what's the dangerous, unprecedented pieces of what this administration is doing, I think is important to situate the relative danger or hazard we have to the ability for this country to continue forward.
Oh, that's deep. Well, yeah. And I particularly love that you called it a regime, because that's what it is. And I think I agree. There's a lot of conversation that they have here about the unprecedented nature of all of this, how his actions and his administration's actions are unprecedented. And she provided some really great context and analysis about what the federal government has previously done to support cities and states. And so I want to pull a quote here. She says, quote, "With the exception of moments when the federal government had to intervene to ensure the proper enforcement of civil rights laws, such as during the Reconstruction period or in Alabama in 1965, I don't believe there has ever been a time in American history when the National Guard was sent into a place without the request of a governor or local officials. The idea that the National Guard would be deployed against the wishes of governors and other state and local officials is unheard of." And then she goes on a little bit later to say, quote, "We saw a lot of National Guard deployments in the 1960s and fewer National Guard deployments during moments of political violence in the early 1970s, in part because the federal government, through the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, essentially militarized local law enforcement. The law facilitated military transfers from the Department of Defense to local law enforcement. And the idea behind that was the feds can't keep on deploying the National Guard in American cities every time black and brown folks get rowdy. So they've got to get the M1 carbine rifles, the grenades, and the tanks to local law enforcement. The intention behind the expansion of the federal government's role in policing was to give local authorities the tools to handle rebellions on their own, because the Johnson administration and subsequent administrations understood that the idea of a federal police force was antithetical to the principles that this country was founded on. And you kind of alluded to that as well. And so there's an awful lot to chew on there. First being, again, that this has never happened in this way before, in the way that the Trump administration has done it, deployed these troops. And this idea that it goes against everything that this country has believed in since the dawn of time. But one of the things she said that I think is so true and so telling is this idea that law enforcement in cities needed military-grade equipment to keep black and brown people in check. And that was done via this Crime Control and Safe Streets Act in 1968. And it's that thinking, that rationale by the United States that we've got to keep black and brown people in line and have to be prepared for when they act up, that is so telling about where we are as a country and as a society. For me, it's contour within the larger painting that is America. It's fuel to the hate that white supremacy feeds on. And it's why this was able to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the important points that Elizabeth makes about that is how black people being included in our society has always been incomplete.
Yeah.
So she says, quote, "Here I'm thinking about Du Bois's arguments in Black Reconstruction about abolition democracy. American institutions have proven that, in theory, they're willing to enfranchise black people politically, but not economically. There has never been an economic enfranchisement. And so those demands are part of what that self-defense, self-determination turn was about. It was like, now we have these new political rights. Now we're no longer living under the fascist authoritarian system of Southern apartheid or Jim Crow, but we are still not fully included in American society, which exploits and economically extracts from us. The next stage of these policies should be ones that provide tangible economic opportunities. Going back to the rebellions in the 60s, many of the participants and many black power figures talked about how when young black people revolted, they got the attention of local officials and policymakers. They were able to make demands. In those moments of rebellion, local organizations and many of the participants would come together and meet with local officials and talk about the larger socioeconomic problems that had led to the rebellions. It was an opportunity to get face time with local officials." And she's talking about this in the context of the nonviolent protest movement of the civil rights era,
right,
and how rebellion set the stage for more demands to be heard after those peaceful protests weren't listened to.
Yes.
And so that's the context that she's talking about this in that turn that she mentions. But you mentioned the way that this military equipment was distributed in order to keep Black people in check. And I think the other thing that this quote speaks to is how entwined white supremacy is with capitalism and how economic exploitation is also used to keep Black people in check.
Yes.
And so we see that through Elizabeth's point that politically, at least in theory, she says, that Black people can be included politically, but economically that progress is not the same.
Yes.
But that's two sides of the same system that recognizes where the power is at and limiting who has access to that power, specifically money.
Yeah.
And the way that money talks in our society and how that's always been a big piece of what power has meant. And that's also who has access to that power,
Yes.
who has access to that money, and controlling that element as well has been a huge piece of it. And I think that that's an element where the systems are willing to bend politically, but not so much economically.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the word you use there, control, is key.
Yeah.
And so it's all of the ways in which we can control Black and brown people. And we can do it by arming local law enforcement with military-grade equipment to keep them in check. And we can do it economically, too. We can oppress them and keep them in a system that isn't beneficial to them, isn't supportive of them, isn't life-affirming in any way. And so that control is key and has always been key. So that's, absolutely. One of the other points that Elizabeth really hits home in this conversation is how these actions by the Trump administration with the National Guard are, and I think Olúfẹ asks her this in a question. He says how they're endemic to our society. And I would say endemic to white supremacy's role in our society. And so Elizabeth responds to him by saying a lot of things, but part of that was, quote, every time white supremacist order appears to be threatened and there appears to be some progress with respect to racial justice, new levels of repression always emerge. This follows that larger pattern. I talk in my work about cycles of police violence, cycles of violence in general, and then policy cycles. And this moment is following a policy cycle, especially with respect to anti-racist policy and anti-racism in American popular and political consciousness. Recent developments are part of a policy backlash from 2020. A number of states passed so-called anti-riot legislation to make it harder to protest, especially in the name of social justice, and to make it easier for counter-protesters to harm protesters. So on the one hand, the response to the largest mass mobilization in U.S. history, and a mass mobilization for racial justice at that, was to make it much harder for people to protest, right? So that's part one. She goes on a little bit later, and she asks some really poignant questions that our government has long grappled with. She says, quote, a lot of what we're seeing now is a response to that, and also general demographic changes in recent decades. A majority of people under the age of 16 in this country are people of color, and if current trends continue, white people will no longer be the majority. These larger questions have always haunted political and economic elites, and they haunted the founders. What is this democracy? Is this a multiracial democracy, or is this a democracy by and for white men? And the question that those in power were confronted with as a result of that racial reckoning is, do we facilitate the country's natural move in this direction, or do we double down and preserve our power and influence? Trump is using a show of force to send a message about who a patriot is, what this country is about, and who has been oppressed, which, in the administration's telling, are white men. And it was that last question in particular that got me in terms of what the government and elites in power are doing. Do we facilitate and embrace this change to our multiracial democracy that's happening? Or do we do everything in our power to instead protect white people and protect our wealth and our power, quite literally by any means necessary? And I think we see and we know the answer to that question, unfortunately. And, we've got to just do everything we can to stop it.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that happens too is how many people become collateral damage.
Oh, yeah.
In that. And so there's a preservation of power through tricking poor white people who will never have access to that power into supporting them. And that's another element that comes into play here too. And especially as we talk about money, we talk about power and access to power,
Yes.
and who has it and who doesn't. There's that the trick that the elites have been playing in this country since Bacon's Rebellion.
Absolutely.
That tricks poor white people into thinking that they've got something to hold on to.
Absolutely.
And to
support
hold on to it, they have to support
this
the
administration.
elites,
Yep.
and in particular this administration. And
Yeah.
I think that's an element that's at play as well here, and we see that as a piece of what Elizabeth is talking about.
Absolutely.
In my mind.
Yes.
And I think that about this show of force that she talks about, and you mentioned, that Trump has tried to show since he announced his candidacy in 2015, he always wanted to be able to show force against those he deemed less than.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first things he said when he announced himself about like Mexican immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the obvious way that this happens, is through a show of force against protesters and an adjustment to policies to make it easier to crack down on protests, or to allow vigilantes to do that work for them and get their hands dirty, but ultimately let them walk free.
Right.
And we also see how that's happening through education, based in a fear of losing connection with those white people in this country who they want on their side to believe that they've got something to lose.
Yes.
They've got something to be invested in by supporting this Trump regime and white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy as a system. And so they see that loss, and they're worried about that too. And so Elizabeth says, quote, "One of the exciting things about the protests in 2020 was how multiracial the protests were. The fact that many of them took place in majority white communities. This appeared to be a commitment that large swaths of the American people were embracing in 2020. Of course, this is terrifying to many people who believe that the United States is and should be a white Christian nationalist republic. One of the first responses is to attack education. We've got to stop teaching about this stuff, because now white people are understanding that racial inequality is not due to pathology, but due to historical racism and institutional and systemic barriers to mobility. That was terrifying." So we see the book bans.
Oh, yeah.
We see the anti-critical race theory nonsense. And we've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast
Yep.
before, but I appreciated this analysis here because it places the conversation in the context as another element of backlash to the 2020 protests.
Yes.
And contextualize it alongside the policy pieces and the police violence and all of those things, and connects the dots between all of it. And I thought that was really an important piece to see how all of this is working together and is an interconnected process and backlash.
Yeah, that's why I said at the top of this, I really enjoyed this conversation, because they did such a great job weaving in all of those pieces of context to tell this story and to tell this narrative about what is happening in this country and what we're seeing. And so this, again, was a brilliant conversation. I think you started to bring us there. So let's shift over to application. How does this piece and our conversation about their conversation apply to our everyday lives and work? Olúfẹ asks Elizabeth a couple of times in their conversation to reflect on this inflection point in politics that we find ourselves in right now, and to talk about what's needed in terms of how we respond to this moment. And I wanted to share part of her response as application, because I thought it was really spot on, and I thought it was a great call to action. So she says, quote, "One aspect of Black Lives Matter that was so appealing is that you could participate by just throwing up a hashtag or making your icon black on Instagram. But that's not organizing. That's not long-term protest. As a student of the Black freedom struggle, organizing is one of the things that we must commit to doing. We also need to think about breaking up the two-party system, because for poor people in this country, this political system has not been working. And the election of Trump and what we're seeing now is a real failure of that system. Organizing with a community for the long-term battle is what's needed right now, because the Trump administration has been rapidly undoing decades of struggle. They've been thinking long-term, and we need to be thinking long-term too. We need a Reconstruction society to counter the Federalist society. We need to start playing from the right's playbook. For a lot of people, there's this tendency to retreat in these moments or to think the problems are insurmountable. But that's not true, and we can't afford to do that. We need to be thinking about how to work alongside and organize with the most marginalized people in this country." And I feel like I have zero notes to add to that, right? She touches on so much that needs to happen and how it's going to take all of us to do it to get to the place that we need to be. So I loved every bit of that.
Yeah.
What about you?
That was really good.
Yeah.
And I think having some organizations that can flip heritage and the Federal Society on its head, I think is a key element
part of this. Absolutely.
process. But we'll see where that goes. My application is from the question, I think, that led to the answer that you just quoted. So Olúfemi says, quote, "The thing that I'm struck by is the political consensus in the U.S. that all these different modes of doing politics, Democrat and Republican, federal, state, and local, long-term, short-term, converge on, we have one solution for urban crime and social problems, which is policing, which is the nightstick, which is SWAT. That seems to be the direction of all the political trends, regardless of party, regardless of time scale." And I think that's something we've talked about a lot here. There is no real response to the concerns of urban crime or poverty or immigration, or even the concerns that I think Trump tried to touch on in his three campaigns. To think about affordability in his most recent campaign. He's got no answer to that. He just named that it was a problem.
Yep.
And ultimately is making that issue worse.
Yes.
So there's never an answer to the problems that particularly the right pose, but not absolving Democrats of any of this either. And I guess there's only more force and more weapons and more police, whether they're federal or local. So as with any abolitionist conversation, we've got to recognize how to create things that actually respond to those issues in a way that doesn't create more violence, but creates more opportunities for life for people.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of our safety, our liberation, policing ain't it. And this response, Olúfemi's question here is absolutely spot on as well. So I'm glad you brought that side of that conversation as well. Very good. All right, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? I really enjoyed Elizabeth Hinton's analysis and perspective in this entire conversation and everything that she brought to it. So I'd love to check out a couple of her books. One of the books is called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s, which is referenced in this conversation. And the other is called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. And I just think both books sound really interesting and like very good reads to potentially add to our very long list of books to check out. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, America on Fire is great. It's eye-opening about how the real progress made in the 60s and 70s were tied to rebellions. And she really points out the evidence of how those things are more connected than some of the stories that we've been told.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah. And I'd love to read the other book you mentioned about mass incarceration and how that was developed through policies that were supposed to address poverty. Because, what another way to point out how devoid of solutions the government has been for so long for actual issues of people.
Yeah. Wow. Very good. Well, that's our conversation about this incredible conversation. Thank you, Olúfemi and Elizabeth, for having it. Thank you, Hammer and Hope, for including it in your latest issue. And we look forward to reading more from that issue. But Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Well, since it's my turn, I'm going to bring the Alabama Solution,
the
documentary that you introduced at the end of last week's episode.
Yes.
We had to delay talking about that for a week, but we will get to it next week. So as a reminder, it's a documentary. It's on HBO, and the very brief description of it on HBO's website is incarcerated men defy the odds to expose a cover-up in one of the United States' deadliest prison systems. And so I've read a little bit more about the documentary. I still haven't had a chance to watch it, but it appears to be fascinating. And I know you mentioned that it's gut-wrenching, at least to me. Yep. You've mentioned that, and I'm looking forward to watching it with some trepidation on the gut-wrenching part of it, but it also looks like it exposes the ways that Alabama chose to spend COVID funds on prison systems. So that was another element that it looks like we'll be talking about next week.
Absolutely, man. Get ready. It's great and eye-opening, and I'm looking forward to talking with it talking with you about it next week. All right, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please leave a rating and review. Please follow us. Please share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.